The artillery shell screamed overhead at 0547 hours, tearing through pre-dawn darkness and exploding 60 yards behind the American line, showering Private Herbert McBride with frozen dirt and shrapnel fragments that rattled against his helmet like hail on tin. He pressed himself deeper into the shallow trench, clutching a rifle that looked nothing like standard military issue, its barrel wrapped in canvas to hide the gleaming brass telescope mounted on top, a mail-order hunting scope he bought with his own money 3 months before shipping out to France. The second shell landed closer, 30 yards this time, and McBride understood with cold certainty that the German artillery spotters had them ranged perfectly, could see every foxhole and trench line from their observation post somewhere in the shattered tree line 2,000 yards distant, invisible in the morning mist, methodically calling in coordinates that would turn this section of the Western Front into a graveyard before breakfast. His company commander was screaming into a field telephone, demanding counter-battery fire, but the American artillery was firing blind, wasting shells on empty coordinates while the German observers sat untouched, watching, calculating, killing with mathematical precision. McBride looked through his scope, felt the familiar weight of the rifle against his shoulder, and made a decision that would either save 200 men or prove his officers right when they called the telescope a useless toy, a foolish waste of money that no proper soldier would need. If you believe stories like this shouldn't vanish with time, subscribe. Let's keep their memory alive together. Herbert Winslow McBride was born in 1873 in Watertown, Wisconsin, the son of a Presbyterian minister who believed in education, discipline, and the precise application of skill to any problem worth solving. Young Herbert grew up hunting in the Wisconsin forests, learning to shoot with his father's old Springfield rifle before he was tall enough to hold it steady without a rest. By age 12, he could hit a deer at 300 yards. By 15, he was winning county shooting competitions against men twice his age. But McBride wasn't interested in competition. He was interested in accuracy, in the scientific principles that govern trajectory and windage and bullet drop, in the mathematical relationship between distance and elevation. He read ballistics manuals the way other boys read adventure novels. He kept detailed notebooks documenting every shot he fired, the weather conditions, the distance, the results. His father thought he'd become an engineer. McBride became a surveyor instead, work that took him across the American West, measuring distances and calculating angles, always with a rifle nearby because the frontier was still dangerous in the 1890s, and a man who could shoot was a man who stayed alive. When the Spanish-American War erupted in 1898, McBride enlisted immediately, not from patriotism particularly, but because war represented the ultimate test of marksmanship skills, the environment where accuracy mattered most. He served in Cuba, fought at San Juan Hill with the Rough Riders, discovered that military doctrine and practical shooting were often incompatible concepts. The Army trained men to fire in volleys, mass fire at close range, tactics that made sense when rifles were inaccurate and battles were fought at 100 yards. But McBride's rifle was accurate at 500 yards, and he preferred fighting from positions where the enemy couldn't shoot back. His commanders didn't know what to do with him. Sharpshooters weren't part of standard infantry doctrine, so they let him scout, let him work alone, let him do things that weren't in the manual because the results were undeniable. By the war's end, McBride had 23 confirmed kills, all at ranges exceeding 300 yards, all single shots that dropped men before they knew they were being hunted. He received a citation for marksmanship and a discharge that classified him as too old for continued service. He was 25 years old. McBride returned to surveying, spent the next 16 years moving across Canada and the northern United States, working for railroad companies and mining operations, measuring distances in wilderness where one mistake could cost lives or millions of dollars. He was methodical, precise, obsessive about accuracy. He upgraded his rifle every time better technology became available, spent his own money on custom barrels and precision sights, experimented with hand-loaded ammunition to find the perfect combination of powder charge and bullet weight. By 1914, he owned a rifle that could reliably hit targets at 1,000 yards, equipped with a 20-power telescope sight he'd ordered from a specialty optics company in Pennsylvania, a beautiful piece of brass and glass that cost more than most men earned in 3 months. His friends thought he was crazy, spending that kind of money on a hunting rifle. McBride explained patiently that accuracy was never expensive when measured against the cost of missing, but they didn't understand. Couldn't grasp that for him shooting wasn't recreation. It was mathematics made physical, geometry expressed through gunpowder and lead. When the Great War began in Europe, McBride followed the news with professional interest, reading reports about trench warfare and artillery barges and machine gun positions, recognizing immediately that this was a different kind of conflict, one where distance and precision would matter more than courage or tactics. The old rules didn't apply. Men weren't fighting at 100 yards anymore. They were fighting at 500, 1,000, ranges where standard infantry rifles were barely effective, where iron sights were useless, where hitting a specific target required equipment and skills that most armies didn't possess. McBride was 41 years old in 1914, far too old for military service, employed in a critical wartime industry, exempt from conscription even if the United States entered the war. He spent 2 years thinking about it, about the geometry problem the trenches represented, about how a man with the right rifle and the right skills could change local tactical situations, about whether he had any obligation to use abilities that almost nobody else possessed. In 1916, he made his decision. He resigned from his surveying position, traveled to Canada, and enlisted in the Canadian Expeditionary Force, lying about his age, using his old Spanish-American War service record to convince the recruiters that he could still soldier despite the gray in his beard and the lines around his eyes. The Canadian Army didn't know what to do with a 43-year-old private who showed up with his own custom rifle and a telescope sight that looked like it belonged on an observatory. The recruiting sergeant tried to confiscate the rifle, said recruits used standard-issue weapons, said personal firearms weren't permitted. McBride demonstrated by hitting a target at 800 yards, 5 shots in a group small enough to cover with a playing card, and the argument ended. They assigned him to the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, shipped him to England for training, then to France in early 1917, depositing him in a trench system near Vimy Ridge where the Western Front had congealed into static lines of mud and wire and concrete bunkers that stretched from the Channel to Switzerland. His company commander took one look at him, saw a middle-aged man with a fancy rifle, and assigned him to sentry duty, figuring McBride was too old for assault work, but could at least watch for enemy movement. McBride accepted the assignment without complaint, set up his position with care, and began hunting. The first kill came on his 3rd day in the line. McBride was scanning the German trenches at dawn, watching for movement, when he spotted a flash of reflected light from a forward observation post 1,200 yards distant. Binoculars, probably an officer or artillery spotter, glassing the Canadian positions. McBride calculated the range, adjusted his scope for elevation and windage, waited for the figure to stop moving, and fired. The man dropped instantly, the binoculars clattering onto the parapet, visible even at that distance to McBride's telescope. The shot drew no response from the German lines. They didn't know where it come from, couldn't locate the source, because McBride was firing from deep in the trench, the muzzle barely visible, the report absorbed by the constant background noise of artillery and small arms fire. He recorded the details in his notebook. Range 1,180 yards. Light crosswind from the west, 1 shot, 1 kill. Then he waited for the next target. Over the following weeks, McBride established a routine that baffled his fellow soldiers and terrified the Germans opposite his section of trench. He would arrive at his firing position before dawn, a particular corner of the line that offered good sight lines and solid earth for a stable rest. He'd set up his rifle with meticulous care, pad the parapet with sandbags to eliminate vibration, arrange his ammunition and spotting scope and notebook within easy reach. Then he'd watch, sometimes for hours, scanning the enemy trenches for targets worth shooting. He ignored ordinary soldiers. Infantry replacements were infinite. Killing them changed nothing. McBride hunted specialists, artillery observers, machine gun crews, sniper teams, officers, anyone whose death would degrade German tactical capabilities. He could identify them by behavior, by equipment, by the way they moved. An artillery spotter stood differently than a rifleman, held binoculars with a characteristic steadiness, stayed exposed longer because he believed he was beyond rifle range. McBride proved that belief fatal, repeatedly, methodically, one careful shot at a time. His company commander noticed after 2 weeks when German artillery fire in their sector became noticeably less accurate. Shells that had been landing with precision were now falling short or overshooting, wasting ammunition, missing targets. Patrols reported that German forward observation posts were being abandoned, replaced with less vulnerable positions further back. Intelligence officers were puzzled until someone connected the timing with McBride's arrival. They interviewed him, asked to see his rifle and scope, listened with growing astonishment as he explained his methods, his target selection criteria, his ballistic calculations. The telescope sight was a revelation. Most military rifles used iron sights effective to maybe 300 yards. McBride's scope provided clear target identification and accurate aiming at ranges exceeding 1,000 yards, triple the effective range of standard infantry weapons. He'd essentially created a weapon system a generation ahead of contemporary military technology, using commercial hunting equipment and 40 years of obsessive practice. The Army responded predictably. They tried to standardize it, to replicate McBride's success with other soldiers. They issued scope rifles to selected marksmen, men with good service records and shooting badges. Almost all of them failed. They didn't understand that the scope was just a tool, that accuracy at extreme range required skills that couldn't be taught in a 2-week course, required an intuitive grasp of ballistics and wind reading and human behavior that came from decades of experience. McBride could look at a distant figure and calculate instinctively the elevation correction needed, could feel the wind on his face and know how many inches it would push the bullet at 900 yards, could predict where a moving target would be when the bullet arrived 3 seconds after he pulled the trigger. The other snipers couldn't do that. They could barely hit stationary targets at 400 yards. So the Army stopped trying to mass-produce McBride's capabilities and instead let him work alone, gave him autonomy to hunt how he chose, where he chose, when he chose, because the results justified the unorthodox methods. By mid-1917, McBride had killed 47 Germans, all confirmed, all at ranges exceeding 500 yards. His personal record was 1,400 yards, a shot that required holding 3 feet above the target and waiting for a precise moment when the wind dropped, a bullet that took nearly 2 seconds to arrive, and dropped a German officer who never heard the shot that killed him. McBride recorded each kill in his notebook with scientific detachment. Date, time, range, wind conditions, ammunition used, target description. He wasn't proud or ashamed. He was documenting data, building a reference library of successful long-range shots that could be analyzed and learned from. The emotional weight of killing didn't seem to affect him. His friends speculated that maybe age had hardened him, or maybe the Spanish-American War had used up whatever horror he had to spend, or maybe his engineer's mind categorized enemy soldiers as problems to be solved rather than human beings to be mourned. McBride never explained. He just kept shooting. The mission came down in October 1917, during preparations for the Passchendaele offensive. Canadian forces were tasked with capturing a ridge complex that dominated the surrounding terrain, a position the Germans had fortified extensively and defended with overlapping fields of artillery fire. Allied artillery had been bombarding the German lines for weeks, tried to destroy the bunkers and gun positions, but the fire was largely ineffective because German spotters could see every Canadian assembly area, every supply dump, every artillery position. They called in counter-battery fire that knocked out Allied guns faster than they could be replaced. Infantry attacks were slaughtered before they reached the German wire, caught in pre-sighted kill zones that the spotters had mapped with deadly precision. The offensive was failing before it started, and everyone knew it except the generals who kept ordering attacks anyway, throwing men in to meet grinders and pretending confusion when the casualty lists came back. McBride's battalion was positioned in a forward trench system designated as a jumping-off point for the next assault, scheduled for dawn on October 26. The night before, German artillery found their position and began systematic bombardment, walking shells through the trenches with such accuracy that entire platoons were buried alive or blown apart before they could take cover. McBride crouched in a dugout with his rifle, listening to men scream, listening to officers shout orders that nobody could hear over the explosions, understanding that unless someone killed those spotters, the dawn attack would be a massacre. When the bombardment paused at 0530, McBride climbed out of the dugout and took his position at the parapet, scanning the German lines through his telescope, searching for the observers who were orchestrating the carnage. He found the first one at 0547, exactly when the next bombardment was scheduled to begin. A German officer in a forward observation post, binoculars raised, clearly visible in the growing dawn light, watching the Canadian trenches, probably about to call in another fire mission. Range, approximately 2,000 yards, extreme distance even from McBride, but the angle was good and the wind was light, and the target was stationary. McBride made his calculations, adjusted his scope, controlled his breathing, and fired. The German officer collapsed backward, the binoculars falling from his hands. The artillery bombardment began 15 seconds later, but the shells fell 200 yards short, landing in empty mud because the new spotter didn't have the correct coordinates and was too shaken by his predecessor's sudden death to call accurate fire. McBride worked the bolt, chambered a fresh round, and began scanning for the next target. The second spotter was more careful, positioned in a concrete bunker with only his head and shoulders visible, a difficult shot at 1,800 yards. McBride waited for him to raise his binoculars, the moment when he'd be most still, most focused on Canadian lines, least aware of danger. When the moment came, McBride fired, and the man dropped, killed instantly by a bullet that entered just below his helmet rim. The artillery fire became erratic, shells landing randomly now, no longer concentrated on the Canadian positions. McBride found the third spotter at 1,600 yards, a young man who climbed onto a ruined farmhouse roof to get a better view, silhouetted against the morning sky. The shot was almost easy at that range. The man tumbled off the roof, and the German artillery fell silent for nearly 10 minutes, the gun crews waiting for coordinates that no longer came. McBride's company commander appeared beside him, demanded to know what he was doing. McBride pointed at the dead spotters visible through the telescope, explained that he was eliminating the observers directing the artillery fire, that if he could kill enough of them the bombardment would stop and the assault might actually succeed. The commander stared at him, then at the telescope, then at the German lines where men were running, clearly panicked, clearly understanding that their forward observers were being hunted by something they couldn't see or counterattack. The commander told McBride to keep shooting, to kill every spotter he could find. That counter-battery fire would provide cover, that this was now the battalion's primary mission. McBride worked systematically, scanning the German line section by section, identifying observers by their equipment and behavior, engaging each target with a single carefully aimed shot. Fourth spotter at 1,400 yards, killed while adjusting his binoculars. Fifth spotter at 1,900 yards, killed while talking on a field telephone. Sixth spotter partially concealed behind a steel plate, killed when he leaned out to get a better view. Seventh spotter retreating toward the rear trenches, killed at 1,700 yards while running. McBride's rifle grew hot from repeated firing, the barrel temperature affecting accuracy, but he compensated by adjusting his calculations, by allowing for thermal expansion and the changed ballistics of a heated barrel. His ammunition supply dwindled. He sent a runner back for more, kept firing while he waited, killed the eighth spotter at 1,600 yards, the ninth at 1,200 yards. The German artillery was now completely ineffective, firing blindly at estimated coordinates, most shells falling in empty terrain. German officers were screaming orders, demanding their observers report, not understanding that the observers were dead, killed by a weapon and a shooter they hadn't known existed. They sent forward new spotters, young men who climbed nervously into positions still occupied by their predecessors' corpses. McBride killed them too. 10th spotter at 1,500 yards. 11th at 1,300 yards. 12th at 2,000 yards. An extraordinarily difficult shot that required maximum elevation and perfect wind reading. A bullet that took nearly 3 seconds to arrive and struck the man in the chest, dropping him into the trench where his body wouldn't be found until days later. By 0900, the German artillery had ceased firing entirely. German commanders, unable to get accurate observation, unwilling to waste expensive ammunition on blind fire, had ordered a general ceasefire until the situation could be assessed. The Canadian trenches fell quiet except for the moans of wounded men and the shouted orders of officers reorganizing their units. McBride's company commander returned, accompanied by a major from Division Intelligence who wanted to see the rifle and scope, who asked detailed questions about ranges and targets, who seemed unable to believe that one man with a hunting rifle had silenced an entire German artillery battalion. McBride showed him the notebook, the detailed records of each shot, the calculated ranges and wind corrections. The major examined a telescope sight, a magnificent instrument of brass and precision glass, clearly custom-made, clearly expensive. He asked where McBride had obtained it. McBride explained that he'd ordered it from a sporting goods catalog 3 years before the war, had paid for it himself, had brought it from Canada, because he'd known the Army wouldn't issue anything comparable. The Major asked if more could be acquired. McBride said probably not, that the company that made them was small, that production took months, that even if you could buy them, most soldiers wouldn't know how to use them effectively. The assault went forward at 1,100 hours, 3 hours late, but now possible because German artillery couldn't provide defensive fire. Canadian infantry crossed the open ground under scattered rifle and machine gun fire, but without the devastating artillery bombardment that had destroyed previous attacks. They reached the German wire, breached it with Bangalore torpedoes, poured into the trenches. Close quarters fighting was brutal but brief. By 1400, the ridge was in Canadian hands. The objective taken with casualties of 30% instead of the 80% that previous attacks had suffered. McBride watched from his position, scope still scanning for targets, still hunting, still calculating. He'd killed 12 confirmed spotters during the morning bombardment, eliminated the eyes of the German artillery network, rendered their most effective weapon useless at the critical moment. The Major from intelligence told him later that analysis estimated McBride's actions had saved between 150 and 200 Canadian lives, possibly more, that without the artillery suppression the attack would certainly have failed and the casualties would have been catastrophic. But McBride wasn't finished. German forces counterattacked at dusk, tried to retake the ridge before Canadian forces could consolidate. They came with infantry support and machine gun teams, and, critically, with new artillery observers who'd been rushed forward to restore fire support. McBride was waiting. He'd anticipated the counterattack, had positioned himself with clear sight lines to the likely German assembly areas, had fresh ammunition, and a cleaned rifle and 4 hours of daylight remaining when the German observers appeared. Setting up positions to direct the counterattack's artillery support, McBride engaged them immediately. 13th spotter at 1,100 yards. Killed while setting up his observation equipment. 14th at 1,400 yards. Killed while scanning the Canadian positions. 15th at 1,600 yards. Killed while talking on a field telephone, probably calling in fire coordinates when the bullet arrived. The Germans realized what was happening, understood that something was systematically killing their observers, tried to adapt. They positioned spotters in deeper cover, used camouflage, limited exposure time. McBride adapted faster. He studied their patterns, predicted where they'd have to position themselves to see the battlefield, waited with infinite patience for the moment when they'd have to expose themselves to do their jobs. 16th spotter killed at 1,800 yards when he leaned around a tree to get a better view, and there McBride stopped, not because he ran out of targets, but because darkness fell and his telescope couldn't gather enough light to identify distant targets accurately. He recorded the final entries in his notebook, cleaned his rifle with methodical care, ate a cold meal of hardtack and canned beef, and slept in his dugout, while a round in the battle continued into the night, infantry fighting with rifles and grenades and bayonets, artillery firing blindly. The entire engagement reduced to close-quarters chaos because the observers were dead and modern warfare had temporarily reverted to ancient methods. The 16 spotters McBride killed on October 26, 1917, represented more than just enemy casualties. They represented a fundamental shift in how warfare was conducted, proof that individual skill and superior equipment could neutralize technological advantages that required entire units to deploy. German artillery in that sector was among the best in their army, supported by excellent observation networks, capable of delivering devastating accurate fire. McBride made it irrelevant. One man, 44 years old, using a rifle he bought with his own money and a telescope sight ordered from a catalog, had degraded an entire artillery battalion's effectiveness to near zero. The implications were obvious to anyone who understood tactics. If one skilled shooter could eliminate artillery observers, imagine what 10 could do, or 100. Imagine if every army deployed specialized marksmen with superior optics and training, capable of engaging targets at ranges where return fire was impossible. Imagine the revolution in doctrine, in equipment, in how battles were fought and won. The British and Canadian high commands understood immediately. Within weeks, programs were established to train dedicated sniper units, to acquire telescopic sights, to develop doctrine for long-range precision fire. The Germans, learning through bitter experience what the Allies had discovered through McBride, did the same. By 1918, both sides fielded specialized sniper units equipped with scope rifles, though none of them matched McBride's skill level. None of them could shoot as far or as accurately, because they learned from manuals instead of spending 40 years in the wilderness perfecting the craft. McBride continued hunting through the winter of 1917 and into 1918, his kill count climbing steadily, his notebook filling with data, his reputation spreading to the Canadian Corps and beyond. Soldiers requested transfers to his battalion just to watch him work. Intelligence officers consulted him about enemy positions and behaviors. Generals mentioned him in dispatches, though always carefully, because officially acknowledging that a 44-year-old private with mail-order equipment was more effective than entire artillery batteries was embarrassing to professional military establishment. McBride was wounded in March 1918, a shell fragment that tore through his left shoulder and punctured his lung, nearly killing him, ending his combat service after 14 months in the trenches. He was evacuated to England, then Canada, then discharged with a disability pension and a collection of medals that he considered far less valuable than his notebook full of ballistic data. His final confirmed kill count was 109 enemy soldiers, almost all of them specialists, observers, officers, machine gunners, men whose deaths had tactical impact beyond simple casualty statistics. Analysis after the war estimated that McBride's actions had prevented somewhere between 300 and 500 Allied casualties, had facilitated numerous successful attacks that would otherwise have failed, had forced German doctrine changes that degraded their artillery effectiveness across the entire Western Front. And he'd done it with a rifle that cost $60 and a telescope sight that cost $45, mail-order equipment that the Army hadn't issued because they didn't believe it was necessary. McBride returned to the United States in 1919, resumed his surveying career, wrote a memoir titled A Rifleman Went to War that documented his experiences with clinical precision, no drama, no heroics, just detailed descriptions of shooting techniques and ballistic calculations and target selection criteria. The book sold poorly. Civilians didn't understand it, couldn't grasp the technical details, found McBride's emotionless recounting of killing unsettling. Military professionals understood perfectly, recognized the book as the most comprehensive manual on long-range precision shooting ever written by a practitioner, adopted it as required reading in sniper schools for the next 3 decades. McBride died in 1933, age 60, from complications related to his war wounds, his lungs never fully recovering from the shell fragment. His obituary mentioned his war service briefly, noted his marksmanship, didn't understand or explain that he'd revolutionized military doctrine using equipment he bought from a catalog and skills he developed hunting deer in Wisconsin forests. The 16 spotters killed on that October morning in 1917 represented the visible fraction of McBride's impact, the dramatic demonstration that proved his methods worked at scale. But his true legacy was a doctrine he inspired. The sniper programs every modern military now maintains, the understanding that individual precision can defeat mass firepower, that one skilled shooter with superior equipment can change tactical situations that entire units couldn't affect. The telescopic sight he used, that beautiful brass instrument that his officers initially dismissed as a toy, became standard equipment. The techniques he documented, the ballistic calculations and wind reading methods and target selection criteria, became foundational training for military marksmen worldwide. The patient, methodical approach he embodied, spending hours waiting for the perfect shot rather than wasting ammunition on marginal targets, became sniper doctrine that persists to this day. They called long-range precision shooting certain death in 1917, said it was impossible, said iron sights were sufficient, said specialized equipment was wasteful, said old men couldn't soldier. Herbert McBride proved every assumption wrong using a mail-order telescope and 40 years of obsessive practice. Killed 16 enemy spotters in a single day and saved 200 men who never knew they'd been rescued by a middle-aged surveyor from Wisconsin who understood that accuracy wasn't expensive when measured against the cost of missing. His rifle and telescope sight are preserved in a military museum in Ottawa, displayed behind glass with a placard that briefly describes the service. Visitors walk past without stopping, without understanding that they're looking at the instrument that changed how modern warfare is conducted, that made individual skill relevant in an age of industrial killing, that proved one man with the right tool and the right training could matter more than divisions. If the story moved your heart even once, subscribe. It's the least tribute we can give to men like him.